You for joining us tonight. We're very pleased this evening to have the opportunity to bring you a debate over Proposition CC. This debate is brought to you by Pomar Foundation's Forum for Civic Advancement, the Gazette, and KOAA News 5. The Forum, since 2002, has been bringing programs such as this to the community because we're designed to support and engage those who are interested in the civic health of the Pikes Peak region. We're thankful to our partners this evening, one of whom is with us, both of whom are with us this evening. Evan Pappas, President of KOAA News 5. Please join me in thanking him. And editor of the Gazette, Vince Bizdek. Thank you. Our moderators this evening are Joy Bunch, Senior Correspondent and Deputy Managing Editor for Colorado Politics and regular contributor to the Gazette, and Andy Koen, Reporter and Anchor for KOAA News 5. With that, I will hand the evening over to our moderators. Please enjoy this civic debate.
Kyle, thank you very much, and so heartening to see so many people who are here and engaged in what is happening. This is a pretty big decision we've got to make here, folks. Proposition CC is going to permanently ask voters to give up their refunds under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, also known as TABOR. You may know that was passed back in 1992. Now, currently, whenever the state of Colorado collects taxes, 2 minutes? 2:30. Okay. Whenever the state of Colorado collects taxes that come in an amount higher than the previous year, then there's a formula that gets applied. Population growth plus inflation, anything above that is supposed to be refunded to the voters. Now, we've hit that TABOR growth limit 9 times in the past 26 years, and it's looking like we're going to do it again this year. In fact, under the current estimates right now in September, because the year hasn't ended, we're looking at an average refund for every voter in Colorado of around $38. Now, in exchange for having that money, what the lawmakers have pledged to do is to split it up into 3 different areas: to increase funding for transportation projects, increase funding through K through 12 schools, and increase funding as well for the higher education, colleges and universities. Now, the ballot question also leaves in place the provision under TABOR that requires voter approval for any new taxes as well as other major financial decisions. Now, here to introduce our 2 debaters this evening, Joey Bunch.
Well, it's a big honor for me to be here in front of you, and it's a big honor for me to introduce these 2 distinguished individuals. I'm very fond of both of them. On my left is Casey Becker. She's the House Speaker, and I'm going to tell you, she's from Boulder, but her district is very diverse and very interesting. It's very rural, in addition to being Boulder. And I've worked with Casey for several years now, and I can tell you that even if you disagree with her politics, you'll have nothing but respect for her work ethic and her integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, Casey Becker. And on my right is another good friend of mine, Michael Fields. He's the executive director of the conservative advocacy organization, Colorado Rising Action. Before that, he was a state leader for Americans for Prosperity, as well as being one of their national officials. You know, Michael was a college baseball pitcher, and he's got a house full of kids, which I think prepares him very well for tonight, because he's going to be pitching and he's going to be speaking to people who don't understand complex things. Michael Fields, ladies and gentlemen.
All right. And just a quick welcome to our viewers who have just joined us for the live video stream on News 5 Now, as well as on our other video streams online as well. Happy to have you here. We are eager to get into the questions, but before we do, I want to just go over a couple of ground rules that were agreed to by both of our participants ahead of time. First of all, Joey and I are going to ask each of our debaters a question. They will have 2 minutes to respond, and the nice folks here at Pomar have agreed to hold up some cue cards letting you know when you've got 30 seconds or 10 seconds remaining. Hopefully we don't go too long so that Joey and I don't have to interrupt and kind of cut you off after that. We may or may not ask some follow-up questions based on the responses, but you should know that if we do, that we will only do so after both participants have had the chance to give a rebuttal, and we will not, again repeat, not be taking live questions from the audience. Instead, what had happened in the last week or so, we have collected a lot of questions through an online forum from our viewers and from the Gazette's readers, and Joey and I, we went through, we curated that for the purpose of time, maybe summarize some of the longer questions so that you would both have more time to do that. And finally, I just want to mention that within the final 6 minutes, we will have 3 minutes apiece for closing remarks. So as we get close to that time, I may need to interrupt. But our hope is to get 8 questions apiece for each of our speakers this evening. For those of you in the audience, we are so glad that you are here, but we do ask that you would be respectful of both participants, regardless of their position on either of these issues. So with that, I'm going to give the first question to Mr. Joey Bunch.
And I would like to ask the first question, to start with you, Speaker Becker. The state has a $32 billion budget. Why do you need my tax return?
Thanks, Joey. So the state budget overall is bigger than it has been in the past, because the state is bigger than it's ever been. We have more people in the state paying more car registration fees, paying more people in our higher ed institutions than ever before. They're paying tuition. That brings in revenue to the state. We also have an aging baby boomer population that is bringing in more Medicaid dollars, requiring more Medicaid dollars, and those dollars come from the federal government and are earmarked for Medicaid. But that doesn't mean that this outdated budget formula that we're talking about tonight isn't causing a problem. It is, because it prevents our general fund revenue from growing. And general fund is where we are paying for K-12 and higher ed, and increasingly transportation. So the additional money that's coming in to the state from the federal government is earmarked. The state's budget is high because more people are paying tuition and more people are paying, for instance, car registration fees. But it's not enough to keep up with the demands that we have in this state. The reason we can't keep up with those demands is that we have an artificial limitation that says even when the economy is going really well, even when people are generating greater income than ever before or more in sales tax, you're not allowed to keep that money and you're not allowed to invest it in the things that matter, in deferred maintenance, in teachers and schools, in scholarships and grants, and in our roads and bridges and transit.
Well, Michael, then how do we pay for the kind of growth that Speaker Becker is describing?
Well, thanks for having me here, Joey, and I want to thank KOAA, the Gazette, Pomar for hosting us. It's an important question on how we fix the problems that we have in our state, how we invest in the things that we want to. The problem is our budget is big and getting bigger. It's $32.5 billion. Just 10 years ago, it was $19 billion. We're going up by over $1 billion every year. And if you look at the last few years even, we passed something called the hospital provider fee, which let $600 million more into our budget. And if you look at that, we have spent some more on education, some more on transportation. The problem is they won't lock that money in for the long term. Right? They say we don't have enough money to fix our roads, to put more money into education, but it is there. We just have to commit those dollars to the priorities that we need. If you look at polling across the state, people want our transportation infrastructure fixed. They want roads fixed. They also want teachers to get paid more. The problem is that too much of our education dollars aren't going in to the classroom, aren't going to teachers. Our education budget since 1990 is up 20%, adjusted for inflation. Teacher pay is down 20% during that same time. We need to get more money into classrooms, into the priorities that we want as a state. I care a lot about the future of this state and agree with the problems. I don't think Prop CC fixes any of that. You can't put Prop CC money towards teacher pay. It cannot go to teacher pay, base pay, and that is a big problem. It also can't go to bonding for roads. You can't, if you don't know how much money you're going to get each year, you can't bond that money for roads. And so this does not fix the problem. We have to prioritize the big budget that we have in order to fix those problems.
All right, thank you both. And I want to thank Hannah Grace, who's been holding up the time cards there. If you guys didn't see, that's where we're keeping on time tonight. So, Michael, this is sort of something you alluded to your last answer, but how will education and transportation, are they going to see a net benefit, as you understand it, with the way this proposition is written? What's to stop future legislatures from taking money away from elsewhere, as they've done in the past, once this new revenue stream is available?
We have no idea how, there's no guarantee that this money is going to go towards the things that they said: transportation, education, higher education. And you look at the past, it's true. When Ref C passed, they have this nice chart that shows where all the Ref C money went. Well, that money substituted for the money they were already spending there, right? So the net gain wasn't there, and I fear that would happen again. And the problem with this is that it's permanent, right? This isn't a 5-year timeout like Ref C was. This would be forever taking your tax refunds from TABOR. And so I do have a problem with the fact that it is a blank check. It's a statute, not an amendment. Therefore, the statute could be changed next year by the legislature, or when the speaker's gone, the next speaker could come in and totally change where that money's going to go. The speaker said that we cannot bind the hands of future legislators, but they want to bind the hands of future taxpayers forever by taking away our TABOR tax refund. So I think that is the biggest problem, and it's why you see a lot of editorial boards across the state saying there is a fundamental problem with the fact that this is a blank check. We don't know the specifics on where this will go. There's no guarantee on where it would go, and I think that's a huge problem with it.
Okay, Speaker Becker, I know that you were instrumental in helping to write this. Your thoughts? I mean, is the legislature going to be able to play a shell game with some money here and switch it from one account once there's another revenue stream coming in?
Thanks, Andy. So when Ref C passed in 2005, we immediately entered a big recession. There wasn't new money like folks had helped after Ref C passed because our budget tanked because of a recession. So it's not that money didn't go where it was supposed to. It went exactly where it was supposed to. It's just that there wasn't as much in the budget. This bill says exactly where the money's going to be going. In fact, it does something one step further than Ref C. Ref C just said it can go to all the things that the general fund pays for. We say it's limited to 3 things, and it has to be a third, a third, a third. And we say it has to supplement, and it can't supplant existing funding. So other than putting it in statute and asking voters, I don't know, and requiring that there be an annual audit done by a third party, I don't know, and having complete transparency on all of it, I don't know how much more we can do than that. Any ballot measure that you all approve becomes law. This is a ballot measure just like any other, and it will become law. And the law is specific about where it would go. So I think that that entire argument is a red herring. It's not true that Ref C money didn't go where it was supposed to. It went exactly where it was supposed to. You can go online and find exactly where it went. And what we're saying is in statute, and it will be approved by voters.
Well, Speaker Becker, TABOR has stood the test of time, both in the courts and the court of public opinion. Is this a historic assault on TABOR?
This is not an assault on TABOR, because TABOR says we are creating a cap in law, but you, local governments, school districts, special districts, state, are allowed to go to the voters and ask to remove that cap. So we are not amending TABOR. We are not attacking TABOR. We are doing exactly what TABOR tells us we can do, which is remove a cap if voters approve it. We are asking for voter approval. That's the essence of TABOR, is go ask voters, and that's what we're doing. So we're actually implementing TABOR. We are not amending it.
Well, Michael, you hear what the Speaker says. TABOR allows for this. So isn't this what TABOR was created to do?
Sure. I think the question here is, why does the ballot language the way it is, right? It doesn't mention TABOR. It doesn't mention the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. It doesn't mention refunds. It doesn't say permanent in there. They're trying to hide the ball on this because they are going after TABOR. Look, it is a first step. And if you read an article last week, the Colorado Sun wrote, you had supporters, representatives of Prop CC saying this is a rehearsal for future efforts, right? They said that this is something that is a first step to larger things. And we know what those larger things are because they are trying to repeal TABOR on the ballot. And so I think they know how popular the Taxpayer Bill of Rights is. If they said that in this ballot issue, I think that it wouldn't do very well. But also this argument that why don't we just put it on the ballot, right? It's just put it on the ballot. That's what Tabor asks. You never hear that argument when it's something they don't want, right? It's only a tax increase that they say, put it on the ballot, we need to vote on it. The governor wants to do a 3 to 5% tax cut. The head of the government here wants to do a tax cut, and the legislature's blocking that by not going to put it on the ballot because they don't want that question asked to voters because they know how it would turn out. This can't be a one-way street when it comes to asking voters if that's going to be the argument. But there's no doubt that it is an assault on Tabor. This is the first step. The money that's coming in, the millions of dollars that's already coming in, is because of that.
Speaker Becker, a rebuttal?
Sure. 80% of counties have already done this. 84% of cities have already done this. 96% of school districts in our state have already done this. None of those were assaults on Tabor. This is not an assault on Tabor. I think that there are people in Colorado that are frustrated with these artificial handcuffs that limit the ability of our state to make critical investments. I think there are people that don't like that. I think that's true. That's not what we proposed in this legislation to repeal Tabor. And what the public decides to do about Tabor is what the public decides to do. I can tell you any change to Tabor will go to voters, and voters will have a chance to weigh in then.
Okay. Well, Mr. Fields, did you want to respond to what
just
the
very
speaker said?
quickly, I mean, there are representatives who are going on debates, going to forums, saying this is the first step. I think we need to listen to the people who are pushing it and the people who are spending money heavily to say that we need to repeal Tabor. I think when you look at it, the local discussion, I would trust my locality, and I think people do a lot more than they do the state. The localities are more accountable. They're closer to the people. The state has shown time and time again that they'll say one thing and do another, and I think that's where voters are looking at. This is why debrucing is different when it comes to the state budget instead of local budget, and they aren't artificial. This isn't artificial. Voters approved this in 1992 on the ballot to make this formula population plus inflation. It's not an artificial formula at all.
Okay. Well, Speaker Becker, why not pursue a full repeal of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights?
Well, I think that there are a lot of people having that conversation. I think that there are folks that believe that this infringes on a Republican form of government. I think that there are people that feel that arbitrary spending caps that don't let the state benefit when we are having good financial times, because that's the only time this measure matters, right? When the state's economy is booming and we're generating more in taxes, we want to be able to invest that in our roads, in our higher ed institutions, in K-12. That's the only time this will ever kick in. So I think there are folks saying, but the entirety of Tabor doesn't make sense. It limits when you can put some things on the ballot. It limits the kind of taxes the state could even propose. So there's a lot that Tabor does. I think most people, when they were voting on Tabor, only knew about the portion that said you're going to vote on future tax increases. But Tabor does a lot more than that. So I think that there is a conversation. When times are good, use the additional revenue that's generated without raising taxes and invest it in roads, bridges, and transit, and education.
And Mr. Fields, could we keep Tabor but still do away with these refunds in these years when we have an upward swing, you think?
Well, I mean, I think we'll find that out when voters vote on it here in November. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Tabor has benefited us for the last 27 years. We have the #1 economy in the country. I think that it has to be a lot more evened out. I mean, the Front Range is doing well. The metro area in Denver is doing really well. Some other places aren't. I think we need to address that. But I think there's no doubt that Tabor has put us in a position where, 6 statewide tax increases lost at the ballot, and that's because legislators wanted to push through huge billion-dollar tax increases. The people said no. I think our state is in a better spot because of that. I grew up in Illinois, and they raise taxes whenever they want, and when that happens, the consequences show a few years later, right? So you have 100,000 net people leaving the state of Illinois every year right now. They have the lowest credit rating in the country. It's happening in Connecticut too. I think the fact that people are willing to weigh in and say, you know what, legislators go down to the Capitol, they do 500 bills a year, they do a lot of stuff on where the money goes, all the different kinds of legislation. All we want to do is have a say in if you raise our taxes and grow government even more. Just give us an ask on that. And I think it's been very successful, and I think if this does pass, that we'll keep fighting and fight to protect Tabor.
I haven't heard anybody say that transportation and education aren't priorities. And I hear legislators say it every session. Speaker Becker, why haven't legislators made transportation and education a priority if you need my tax return to help you get there?
So I think we have made that a priority, but the general fund is responsible for other things as well. The Department of Corrections, our prisons, healthcare, higher ed, transportation, and K-12, and human services. So you can choose for yourself what you would want to cut. If we're going to start cutting out of that, the things we're looking at is money for foster care, money for intellectual and developmentally disabled people, money to cut our budget for our prisons and reduce the ratio we have of prison guards per prisoner. We can't cut K-12 and then prioritize it. So the things we could actually cut are really limited. And they're not trade-offs that anyone is actually suggesting that we make. I have yet to hear someone actually identify what in the general fund budget should be cut. Folks say, well, we're spending too much on health care. I agree. I just don't know how to fix that when we have an aging baby boomer population and no one has figured it out. Our population is growing and getting older and relying more on Medicare and Medicaid. There's not a solution, but if you have it, I'm all ears for that. In the meantime, Colorado is now able to collect internet sales tax, but we don't get to use it. Colorado has more people moving into this state, generating income tax, but we don't get to use it. Why are we not making the investments with general fund revenue that we should be making? It's because we have an artificial cap that no other state in the entire country has. No one does this. If we want to have a top-notch state, we need to be making the investments in our infrastructure. Our entire general fund budget is K-12, higher ed, transportation, healthcare, and human services like the ones I pointed out. We are in a very efficient state, but I don't actually want to cut aid to developmentally and intellectually disabled people. I don't want to cut our prison budgets by having worse staffing ratios. I want to actually benefit from the growth the state has and invest back in our community. That's all we're asking here.
Michael, the most conservatives I talk to love the idea of direct democracy, and certainly that's at the heart and soul of Tabor. Why is letting people decide to invest their money in education and transportation, why is that a bad idea?
It's not, and I think when you look at it, that's, the elected officials should be doing it. We elect them to make those priorities. When they ask for polling and it shows that those are the top priorities, they should go and do it. I think the question is, should we be giving them more money if they're not prioritizing the money that they have? And you look at it, I think I want to make this clear. We talk about the general fund and everything else. There's a $32.5 billion budget. We all pay for that in one way or another, right? Either fees, either it's federal funds that we're paying taxes, or we're paying state taxes in towards it. So as that money grows, it's still coming out of our pocket in some way. And even the general fund, though, since the recession, 2008, Pew Research came out with a study, and it showed that we are the #2 state in the whole country for how much our budget general fund has grown since the recession. We're #2. These ideas of cuts or that we don't have enough money, we are growing faster as a general fund, even under Tabor, than these other states. And so I think we have to have an honest discussion about why isn't money getting towards roads more, right? We passed Ref C, $2.1 billion. We passed faster fees, increased our car registration, $250 million. Then we went out and we did hospital provider fees, $600 million. That was the Sustainability of Rural Colorado was the name of it. It's supposed to help rural hospitals, rural roads, and rural schools. Right? 2 years later, we sit here and we have the second to last rural roads in the country. Right? We want to see fixes to these problems with the money that they have before we're going to give them more. And so I think those statistics show our budget's big, it's getting bigger, whether that is general fund or non-general fund, and they need to put that money towards education and transportation.
All right, thank you. Mr. Fields, wondered if you'd finish this sentence for me. If Proposition CC passes,
there's going to be a much bigger battle in the future for tax increases and repeal of Tabor. I mean, there's no doubt if they can't win this ballot issue, right, with the biased ballot language that's out there that has nothing to do with what it actually has to do with. If they can't win that, I don't see how donors and investors and grassroots support really materializes to do more. If they win it, I think you're going to see tons of money dumped in, and this is going to be a huge battle because you have a legislature who wants to raise taxes. They want a progressive income tax. They've said this time and time again, that they want to raise taxes on Coloradans. And if they're going to do that, that's going to be the next battle. So I think Prop CC, if it passes, it's just going to become a bigger battle here in Colorado. What kind of future of a state that we want to have, and if it fails, I think that we'll be in really good shape as a state.
Okay, Speaker Becker, same question. If Prop CC passes,
If Prop CC passes, we will have a more prosperous Colorado because we will make more investments in our roads, bridges, and transit. We'll make better investments and more investments in higher ed and keep tuition lower. And we'll have better K-12 system because schools will have more money to invest in their teachers, in their classrooms, in their equipment, in their school buses. It's going to be better for Colorado if we can actually retain the revenue we're already collecting in taxes in good years and invest it back in our state.
Well, let me ask the converse of that. If Prop CC fails, does the sky fall in on us?
If Prop CC fails, we're going to see continued degradation to our roads because we don't have enough money in gas tax to pay for that. So gas tax was last raised in 1992 and it was 22 cents. Today, gas tax is 22 cents a gallon. It's not indexed to inflation, and cars are more fuel efficient. So we are having less buying power every year. That we have to make up for that in some way. This is one proposal to do it. If we don't pass Prop CC, we're going to continue to have and have-not counties when it comes to school funding. I do not think that your zip code should determine the level of educational opportunity you get. We want to be investing more in schools so that our kids have a better chance at success. And I want that to be true whether they're in Boulder, which will pass local taxes, or whether they're in Grand County, which I also represent, which doesn't pass local taxes. So if we want a more prosperous state all across the state, this is, I think, the best first step we can take.
Well, let me ask a follow-up to you, Speaker Becker, before I get to you, Michael. Wouldn't urban schools do better? I don't understand the funding formula here. You know, the big urban schools have more students, so if it's based on a per-student basis, don't the rich just get richer? Casey?
Oh, that's for me. Mm-hmm. So the bill says that the money gets distributed on a per pupil basis. It doesn't say it has to be equal across all school districts. So all of our school funding does happen on a per pupil basis, but from school district to school district, it actually is different depending on the particular factors in that school district. So I think that more investment in schools is going to be more prosperous schools wherever that goes. But no, I don't think if you want to address inequities, raising the tide for everyone is one way to do that.
Well, Michael, if Prop CC fails, is that a victory for truth, justice, and the American way? I mean, explain this to me.
I think it'll do a few things. One, and I want to address the education discussion on this. I'm a former teacher. I taught 4th and 6th grade. Care a lot about what teachers are going through, the tough teacher pay scales that they have, how they have a hard time living in some of the communities that they're in. I think we have to address that. The problem is Prop CC puts more money into a system, potentially, if it goes to where they say, it puts more money into a system that is unfair and unequal to start with. All it does is pile on that process. There are certain school districts in this state that are getting the short end of the stick, a lot of them in rural Colorado, who don't get the same amount of benefits from the state that some of these richer districts do. And so I think that has to fundamentally change. Putting more money into the system doesn't do that. I also think it would force a conversation about how much money is going to administrative costs. If you remember Denver Public Schools last year, an article came out that said they're spending way too much on administrative costs, and there was a backlash from teachers. And I think that discussion has to happen on the local level and on the state level to say where's money going? How can we get more into the classroom? Only 54% of the money we spend on education gets to instruction. Next door in Nebraska, it's 65%. We can do a lot better job on that. But I think it would also force a discussion about bonding for roads, right? The money's there because of hospital provider fee. all we have to do is lock that money in the long term. And so I think it'll force discussions that have to happen, fixes that have to happen. And so I think it's a very positive thing if this goes down, because we'll start prioritizing our budget.
Okay.
So,
A
I'm
rebuttal?
sorry, Andy, may I respond to that? How much your own school district is paying for admin costs versus anything else is a decision made by your local school district. The state does not mandate specific funding in specific areas. All decisions about school funding are made at the local level. If you're not happy about that, talk to your school board. But we would not have wanted to fix the school funding formula, which does need addressing in this. This is not a bill to fix all things for all people at all times. The school funding formula, I think, does have mistakes in it, but it's hard to fix because anytime you change it, you're going to be taking money away from schools and giving it to other schools, and it's a net zero-sum game. So I think I would love to work with Michael and anyone else. There are legislators here in the audience who are working very actively and for many years to fix how money gets distributed across the state and the factors and things like that. There are things about that need to be fixed. But if you don't, if you think there's too much going for administrative costs in your school district, you need to talk to your school board. In the meantime, we can do a lot to help schools all over and not create such huge disparities from one location to another by passing Prop CC.
Okay. Michael, a response to the rebuttal?
Just briefly, I think this is where leadership comes into play. And you say, you know what, if we know that there are problems with the funding formula, we know it's unfair to certain schools, we're going to step up and fix that funding formula without saying we have to increase taxes in order to do it. Then people might have more faith in the system to say, you know what, they're fixing real problems. Schools are suffering because of it, especially in rural Colorado. I don't think that they deserve to sit here and wait for a discussion about tax increases when they're not getting a good deal. And so I think that's where leadership comes in, and then people will have more faith in the system once it is in putting more money in the system potentially if it's a fair system.
I'm all for leadership and addressing our school funding formula. It just isn't going to happen in this. If you want to fix everything in this one measure, then you're really not. We do not want to fix all things in one bill. That's not the way the legislature works. In fact, there's a constitutional amendment that prohibits that. It's called the single subject rule. We're fixing one thing at a time. I agree with Michael. Let's fix the school funding formula. In the meantime, we can make our schools all over better by just being able to keep the taxes we're already already collecting, and invest them where we need them most.
Okay. Well, that kind of opens up this next question on how will the money be spent. And Michael, I'm going to start with you, but you've characterized this as a blank check. How so? I mean, the money is determined by the TABOR formula.
So basically, the money will go out a third is what it says. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a statute. And, our TABOR tax refunds will be taken forever. And I don't know who legislators will be 20 years from now. I don't know 5 years from now who they'll be. But they could go in at any point and say, we're going to move this money somewhere else, and we don't have a say in that process. They can change the statute, but they can also just, take the money and spend it somewhere else and then say that, we're going to cut the normal general fund budget for that item. It's fungible. This is what happened with Ref C, especially with higher education. It's why former Senator Hank Brown, who was a big supporter of Ref C with Bill Owens at the time, they're looking at Prop CC, here some years later and saying this is a bad idea because basically that money didn't go where they said that it was going to go. And so I think that's the fear, is that knowing that it's a statute, knowing that legislators are in charge of this money ultimately, and they can make this audit look however they want to make it look. What we want to see is what are the total funds going to this? Is this money going to be on top of other things, or are we going to continue to do what we've been doing and spend it elsewhere and then say we need another tax increase? We told you this wasn't quite it. Now we got to go back and raise taxes even more. So I think that's the fear, is this is a blank check, and it's why several editorial boards recently came out and said, why would we give them a blank check? Go back, try again. This is not the right process.
Okay. Well, Speaker Becker, on the topic of how the money will be spent, I mean, Mayor John Suthers has said that passing TABOR exemptions here in Colorado Springs has required telling people specifics on where the money would go. So why is Prop CC so vague with this respect?
Prop CC isn't vague. I mean, just because he says that doesn't mean it's actually true. It's actually very specific in how the money gets distributed. And I think it's disingenuous to say you have to go to voters, but if voters approve it, it's still not good enough. So we are doing exactly what the law says. We are very specific. I think it doesn't matter what we would have said in it. They would have said it's a blank check because they don't really have any other way to attack it when this is just a common sense proposal to say the taxes that are generated because our state population and because our state economy are booming, let's actually invest that in the state. But the bill is very specific in how the money gets spent. It is in law and it will be voter approved, like the other ballot measures that voters have passed that if it's an increase in the cigarette tax, that money it's just the same. This is not any different. I do not think it is right to put formulas in the Constitution. That's not what our Constitution is there for. We have formulas in our Constitution right now, and it's part of what exactly created this problem. There are many people in this room who are actually wanting to change Gallagher because it put a formula in the Constitution that is actually shifting more and more of our local property taxes onto business. So you can have that argument. At the end of the day, we should not be putting formulas in the Constitution. A voter-approved ballot measure that is specific, voters are going to say how this money is spent, and the legislature is going to be held accountable through an independent audit and through the legislative process about how it's spent. There's just no other way to do this, and proposing a constitutional amendment just creates a higher hurdle and creates problems down the road. That's not what we want to do. We are actually trying to fix the state problems, not create new ones.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want to ask you a follow-up question and allow Michael a rebuttal. Now, we know that a third of the money is going to go to K-12 schools, a third is going to go to higher ed, and a third is going to go to transportation. But let's just take K-12 schools. Where does it go once it goes to the school districts? Does it go to teacher bonuses? Does it go to air conditioners? Does it go to sidewalk paving?
School districts, your school boards, get to decide for themselves how the money is spent. Because the money may not be there from year to year, it just depends on how the economy is doing. These have to be non-recurring expenses. But some things that school boards have said they would spend it on, Denver Public Schools said they're going to put air condition in their schools. Others have said school buses. Others have said technology. Others have said money to attract and retain teachers. Others have said we're going to shift one-time money into our Prop CC money and raise teacher salaries. So it's really up to the school board, which allows for a lot of local input in how that gets spent.
What about the Department of Transportation? How are they going to spend this money?
Thanks, Joey, for asking. So the formulas that we propose in Prop CC is very specific. 18% goes to cities, 22% to counties, 15% to CDOT's transit office, so things like Bustang, and 45% for major highway projects.
Well, Michael, what's your take on all that?
Well, one thing, I think Mayor Suthers is right in that the issues that pass are local, specific, and sunset, and this is none of those things. I think the biggest problem that a lot of us have with this is looking at the ballot language, right, and saying the legislature passes the ballot language, they want the money, they pass the ballot language, there's no check on that, right? If you or I go and try to put something on the ballot, we got to go through the title board, and the title board says you can say this and you can't say that. Well, this ballot language starts out with without raising taxes. Okay, maybe it doesn't raise tax rates, but it surely raises taxes in that they're keeping and spending more of your money, $1.7 billion over the next 3 years. Our tax liability is going up. And so they're able to say this, and if they were honest, right, they have to hide the ball on this with their ballot language, right, because they know if they ask straight up, can we keep your TABOR tax refunds forever to possibly fund transportation and education? The answer would be no. And so I don't have a problem with voters weighing in. I just want them to weigh in with correct information in a process that the legislature, is using a biased process in order to get this on the ballot and to take that money from us.
So let's talk about correct information, because it's not $1.7 billion over the next 3 years.
That's what the governor
we
has.
only have forecasts for 2 years out This would start in the next budget year, and that's less than $600 million. There's no one actually who's forecast beyond that. What you're doing is talking about the TABOR refunds that are going to happen this year, and this bill doesn't cover that.
Nope.
So $600 million over the next 2 years, and that equals about $38 per person per year. It's not a lot of money. It's the cost of a cup of coffee a month. $38, but we can, and it's not going to solve everything, but we can make a dent.
Michael, you seem to agree.
Well, I just disagree with that. The governor put out stats last week or the week before. Talks about $428 million that we will get in refunds this year. That is what we will get back.
And that's not counted in this ballot.
The ballot language talks about next year, right, is when it starts, and it goes 3 more years. The governor projected those 3 years in his, when they released it, and it said $1.7 billion is not counting this year. So that is the projection that the governor, the Democratic governor here, is saying that will come back in refunds, $1.7 billion.
Okay. Well, Michael, I want to ask you the next question. Has TABOR outlived its usefulness in Colorado government, given there have been a large number of school districts especially that have held elections to essentially, I think the nickname is debrucing, but they say we're not going to, abide by the revenue caps from here on out?
No, I don't think that TABOR has, met its time. You look at it, we do have the #1 economy in the country right now, and I think we need to keep that up. I think a big part of it is because they can't raise taxes whenever they want. I think localities have decided to do this, and that's up to them, and they can make that decision. I think the state is a much different entity, and we need to have that discussion, which we are right now. But I think when you look at it, TABOR has done a lot of good things for us, but the legislature is going around it anyway, right? It used to be that 1/3 of the budget was outside of TABOR. Now 2/3 of the budget are outside of TABOR. And when you look at the legislature, this is the only check we have on 1/3 of the budget. There was a Colorado Sun article that came out a couple weeks ago that said the legislature has already overspent next year's budget by $100 million. Right, so they've overspent. So all these promises they're making about where this money is going to go, 40% of that money is already doled out to something else right now. And I think having that conversation of, can we keep that check on population plus inflation for 1/3 of the budget isn't asking for a lot right now. And I think that overall discussion about TABOR is a great one to have.
Okay, well, Speaker Becker, would you like to address the question, or would you like to rebut Mr. Field's answer here?
So this is only 1/3 of the budget, but it's 1/3 of the budget that pays for K-12 and higher ed. And it's becoming the 1/3 of the budget that increasingly covers transportation. So you're right that there's more money coming into the state from the federal government for Medicaid. I think that that's a help to our seniors. I don't think seniors want to see Medicaid go away. But when we're talking about what the general fund funds, and we're talking about schools, higher ed, transportation, and as I mentioned, it also covers prisons and human services. We're tackling a piece of that. And these are things that if you want to have a prosperous state, you need to be investing in. This is, like I said, about $37 per person per year over the next 2 years to make some significant but small good starts in addressing some of our most needy parts of the budget. But we cannot take those Medicaid dollars, and we do not want to take those Medicaid dollars and start funding it, using it in violation of federal law on K-12. That's where our budget's been growing. And again, there's more spent on Medicaid now than ever before. Okay. But that's because we've got an aging baby boomer population.
Michael, rebuttal?
Okay.
No? Okay. Very good. Well, in that case, Speaker, did you have a thought on the question of whether or not TABOR, Colorado, has it outlived its usefulness with respect to how we govern ourselves here in the state of Colorado?
So we are proposing addressing one aspect of TABOR, which says we are creating an artificial, and I think it's an outdated budget formula, but we're going to address that one piece of TABOR here that says go to voters. And if you're having a prosperous time and you're generating more in revenue, ask voters if you can keep it. That's what we're doing. Because I think Colorado's booming population, I think that more and more people are actually moving to Colorado, driving on our roads, buying our goods, the internet sales tax that we should collect, should actually be a boom to the state. Growth is not paying its own way because TABOR prevents it. All that growth that's happening in Colorado right now isn't actually benefiting our state budget. Now, we're not going to close the doors. We're not going to close the borders to Colorado so that new businesses and new people don't move here. We're glad that people are making more money. We just want that to end up in a benefit to the state. We want the growth that Colorado's experiencing to actually benefit our schools and our roads.
All right, well, I've got good news. We've actually made it through 8 questions, and beyond that, we've got time for just a couple more before we move into our closing statement. So, Joey, I'm going to invite you back up for another question.
Well, you know, Colorado is the only state that does TABOR. If TABOR is so awesome, Michael, why haven't other states followed us?
Well, I mean, we're #1 economy in the country too. So whenever people bring that up and say, you know, Colorado's the only one that did this, I'd say, yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with why we are where we are. I think it's a common thing across the country that legislators like to spend money regardless of their political party, and I don't think they like to give up that ability to raise taxes whenever they want. And so I think other states, they do have some spending caps, and you know, some legislatures have to do a 2/3 to raise taxes. There's other things that are similar. I think that they should take up what we do here, and I think it's been very beneficial to us. So I think the fact that nobody else has done it, I think maybe it's just a bad kept secret, but I think they should, and I think it's benefited us.
Well, Casey, let me ask you the question just a little bit differently. If TABOR is such a problem, why haven't the voters gotten rid of it already? And why have other states not followed us?
Well, we haven't been asking voters to get rid of it, and we're not asking voters here to get rid of it. So, and the legislature's not going to be doing that next year either. That's not what we're doing. We're doing what, as I mentioned, 96% of school districts have already done, and 80% of counties have already done, and 84% of cities have already done. Folks are trying to confuse the issue and make this about voting on taxes. That's not what we're doing here. We're not taking that away. That is not something the legislature is proposing. That's not this ballot measure. We're not amending TABOR. We're not repealing TABOR. We're saying TABOR creates an artificial, outdated, unnecessary, unproductive budget cap that doesn't let the state benefit when the economy's growing, and that actually prevents the state, prevents growth from paying its own way. That's all we're talking about. So you can keep trying to muddle the issues, but the truth is we're doing what TABOR asks, we're doing what local governments have done through and through, and we're only addressing this outdated budget cap that keeps a growing economy from actually benefiting our roads and schools.
Michael, would you like to respond?
Well, I just think the people that are confusing it are on your side then, because I read the article and they said time and time again, this is about raising taxes, future efforts, this is a rehearsal. And the people that are giving money are saying the exact same things at the kickoff to Yes on CC. They're saying this is just the first step. So I don't think we're confused on this at all. We know what it is. And people that are representing Yes on CC are out there doing debates and doing forums saying we're going to raise your taxes in the future. That's what's happening.
Like I said, what the public is talking about, what different groups are talking about is not what's here. It took TABOR 4 times to pass because they kept bringing it up and kept saying, this is the way for Colorado to grow. All I'm doing is saying, TABOR says go to voters and asking if you can keep the revenue already being sent to the state. I just want to address things like deferred maintenance, the need for school buses, and things like that, because Colorado does have a booming economy. It should just be a benefit to the rest of us in the state.
Speaker Becker, I want to ask you this to start, but we have listed some of the issues with transportation, education, and other areas where we wanted to see more funding. Does Colorado have a revenue problem or a spending problem?
I think that is a sort of a false setup. I think that we know we are not investing in the areas that we rely on the general fund to make investments in. We know that the state is $2,700 per pupil below the national average on K-12 funding. We know that Colorado's 48th in the country for per pupil investment in higher ed, 48th. We know that Colorado's almost dead last when it comes to per resident investment in roads, bridges, and transit. So we don't have a revenue problem. We need, if we're in last places in all these ways, and the main source of funding that we can go to for any of this stuff is the general fund, but the general fund's already funding all this, I think it's worth $37 per person to make at least a dent in some of those things.
Okay, Michael, same question. Do we have a revenue problem or a spending problem?
Spending. When you look at it, our population has gone up 60% since TABOR passed in 1992. Our state budget has gone up 306%, right? Far outpacing inflation and population. And so we're really only talking about a third of the budget again. I think when you talk about the refunds, according to the governor's projections, the refunds would be over the next 3 years, $248 per individual, $638 for joint filers. This is a significant amount of money. I think, there's a lot of Coloradans who might not agree and say we need to cut taxes like I think we should, like the governor says. They might say, our spending is okay the way it is. I think we're talking about adding more onto it, and I'm glad that the speaker said that we don't have a revenue problem, so I'll, be happy to have her on our side when the tax increase comes the next year and the year after that. So looking forward to that.
Okay. Speaker Becker, it looks like you may want to rebut that.
Our budget is bigger because there are more people in Colorado. Like I said, paying more in tuition. Our universities are the highest level of population that we've ever had. Since 1992, there were a huge increase in landlines that paid more into our broadband fund that is helping rural broadband. There's more people buying cars in Colorado that are paying car registration fees. All of that goes into our state budget, but it's not enough to keep up with the maintenance on our roads. And like I said, the federal government's increase because we have more seniors in Colorado than ever before. They are requiring more in Medicaid dollars. So don't try and confuse the fact that there is increases in certain ways in the state budget for why we can't make the investments that we need to in K-12 and roads and higher ed, because that's not where this money's going. We need to be investing more in those things, and there are limited ways that we can do that. So yes, Colorado's economy is bigger than it ever was. Yes, there are more people in higher ed institutions paying tuition that goes to that $32 billion that we're talking about. I think those are good things that so many people want to come to our universities. But we're falling behind in our general fund, and that is not the way successful states stay successful.
Okay. And Michael, did you want to respond to the rebuttal?
I'm good.
Okay. Well, I would like to ask a follow-up then, because what we're talking about here is sort of a matter of scale. I think some of the numbers I've seen are an anticipation of around $300 to $350 million. Well, you split that three ways. When you've got $9 billion that's spent on education and $2 billion that's spent on transportation, in terms of scale, Speaker Becker, is this going to accomplish what you're hoping for it to do in terms of increasing spending?
Sure. I think it makes a dent. I think schools are saying, if they can invest even $50,000 in a new air conditioning system, even $50,000 for their school district in attracting or retaining teachers, I think, would that make a difference in your bottom line? Would that make a difference in your son's or daughter's school? Yes. Would it make a difference in terms of the local share that my city would get out of transportation? Absolutely. It makes a difference, but I don't think it solves the problem long term. I do think that we need to find revenue to be investing in these critical state resources.
And Michael, a response?
No, I think when you look at it, the amount of money, one, we don't know where it's going to go specifically, but two, I think for transportation, nobody likes bonding, right? Nobody wants to do that. But when you have billions of dollars of needs, I think I've talked about this and said there's about $3.5 billion in transportation needs that we could address right now. We have to bond the way that we did when T-Rex happened, when Governor Owens was governor. There's a roadmap for how you do it. They need to lock that money in as a legislature and say we're going to prioritize transportation out of our general fund and make sure that our state roads get fixed. I think they have to do it.
So guess what? TABOR prevents bonding unless voters approved it. Voters were asked that last year and rejected it.
Well, what I hear here is that growth is the problem. Are we doing enough to make growth pay for itself? Should we be looking at these new residents and new industries to pay more instead of leaning on the people who are already here? Speaker Becker?
I think that there are a lot of different ideas out there for how to meet the state's budget needs. This is one that I think is common sense. It's small. It's a first step. I think that the state should be able to benefit from, like I mentioned, increased internet sales tax, which we weren't allowed to collect under federal law a couple years ago. I think that, like I said, more people are working in Colorado and they're generating more in income. That's generating more to the state, and we're falling behind on things. So if anyone has a different proposal, great. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is needing new revenue to the state. This is one proposal, but I think it's one that is smart because it doesn't raise taxes. It just says, can we keep the taxes you're already sending us?
Michael, should we be leaning harder on the people who are getting rich off growth to pay more?
No, I mean, I think when you look at it, I think the state government has a responsibility with the money that it has coming in already, and there's significant money coming in from those people already. And I think you have to look at, are they using the money that they have most effectively? And I don't think that that's the case right now. You look at year after year, the budget gets bigger. And Speaker Becker is, talking a lot about the growth, and I just don't think growth is necessarily the problem. I think, we have the resources to fix these problems, and I want to see the legislature and the governor step up and do it.
I don't think growth is the problem either. I think the problem is that the state can't actually benefit from the growth that's happening because we have an outdated budget formula.
Okay, well, we have reached that point in the evening where it is time for our closing remarks. Each candidate, or each speaker, not candidate, will have the ability to speak for 3 minutes apiece. And since Casey, you had the first question, we will allow Michael to have the first closing remarks.
Well, I appreciate you coming out, listening to this. This is an important issue for our state. Thank you to the host. I have 3 kids that are 6 years old and younger. I want the best Colorado possible for their future. Our state, like any state, has a lot of challenges, and we've talked about those tonight. We need to fix our roads. We need a fair system when it comes to our funding formula to districts. We need to make sure that more money gets into teacher pay. We need an economy that works for all of Colorado, not just the Front Range. But Prop CC doesn't fix any of those problems. The editorials for the top 2 newspapers in the state, the Gazette and the Denver Post, have told Coloradans to vote no on Prop CC. The Gazette said that you shouldn't give politicians a blank check. The Denver Post called Prop CC fatally flawed. And I know this is just a first step to more taxes. It's a first step to repealing TABOR. When TABOR passed in 1992, they said that Colorado would be closed for business. They said that there would be chaos. They said that the Pope wouldn't be safe in his trip here in 1993. The Pope made it. He lived 12 more years. But none of these claims came to fruition, right? We have the #1 economy in the nation, and unemployment is around 3%. TABOR simply tells politicians that they have to ask us before they want more money, and it limits the growth of government to population plus inflation. It's worked well for us for almost 3 decades now. So I urge you, when you get your ballot here next week, to vote no on Prop CC. And I think whether this passes or not, we should all be committed to working together to address our state's challenges and keep Colorado as the #1 economy in the country. Thanks.
Michael, thank you very much. And now it's time for closing remarks. Speaker Becker.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Andy and Joey, for creating a really fun and engaging debate. So there's just one limited proposal in front of you today, and that's to say that given the fact that Colorado's economy and population are booming, should the state be able to benefit from that and remove the outdated budget formula that we have that prevents us from investing money that the state's already collecting and investing it in 3 areas: K-12, higher ed, and transportation. I have 2 sons, an 8 and an 11-year-old, and when my son was in 2nd grade last year, there were 29 kids in his class. And I know that teacher could have benefited from having a little help in the classroom. I think my child would have benefited. I think if we can benefit our teachers, benefit our kids, we are going to be benefiting our state. I think that tuition is skyrocketing in Colorado because the state is not making the investments in our own public institutions that we should be. And if Colorado isn't doing a better job of paving our roads, filling potholes, addressing problems with our bridges, we are not going to keep having the #1 state in the economy, because businesses will not invest in a state that's not investing in itself. If we want to continue on a prosperous path, we should do what prosperous states do and invest in the areas that need it. But we cannot take the areas of funding that the federal government earmarks for certain populations and invest it in our roads and K-12 and higher ed. We need to be doing that ourselves here in Colorado. It's a small proposal. It's not going to fix everything, but it is common sense, and it will only even get triggered when Colorado has a booming economy. So I ask you to vote yes for Prop CC this November.
All right. Well, thank you both, Speaker Casey Becker and Michael Fields, for being here with us this evening and informing our audience about this important issue. I know this is not one of those big presidential elections, but seeing so many people here in the audience this evening gives me hope that everybody realizes that even in odd-year elections, there are consequential items that are on the ballot, and this is certainly one of them that could have an impact on our state either way, no matter how it goes. And I understand that ballots will be put in the mail here at the end of this week, so you should be looking out for those. Every registered voter in the state of Colorado will be receiving their ballot, and make sure that you read through it and fill it out. By now you've probably received your blue books as well from the state of Colorado as well, so lots of resources to be able to help inform your decisions, and that's really why we wanted to do this evening. So on behalf of KOAA News 5 and the Pomar Foundation, the Gazette, Joey, I'm really thankful that everybody was able to be here and to attend, and to our viewers who are watching the live stream and on News 5 now, happy to have you join us this evening. And again, thank you to our speakers for a very informative and lively debate. Have a good night.
So we'll do another one.